Hey there, this is my quick setup of F5 Container Ingress Services inside Google Cloud using managed GKE clusters. So the first step is to do a quick git clone on my repo. Within this repo, there's going to be some infrastructure you can build and some big IPs. Go over to terminal and just type git clone and then the address of the URL, and now it's inside your directory. Step 2 is to deploy the VPC networks and the firewall rules. That's all done within the infrastructure only folder. So within here, you're going to have a tfvars example file. Go ahead and rename that, and then paste your values specific to your environment and your project. Once you do that, you can open a terminal. I use the terminal within VS Code, and I just launch directly from there. So first, do a Terraform init to grab the modules and providers, and then you can do a Terraform plan and Terraform apply to actually create the cloud objects. In this case, it's creating some subnets, some VPCs, and some firewall rules. The output is important. Grab those variables, save them to a text file. You'll use them later. You can validate the objects created within the GUI of the Google console. In this case, a management, external, and internal network. So now we move over to the same repo. We'll go into the standalone folder. This is going to deploy a BIG-IP using the networks you just created. So same thing, go into the tfvars file, example, rename it, paste your values specific to the networks that you just created, your public key, and some other items. Make sure you follow the repo. There's some README in there, so that way you can go through the whole instruction set. So same thing, you got to do a Terraform init within this directory. That'll pull down the modules and providers, and then you could do an apply, and the apply is going to launch your BIG-IP and onboard it and get it ready for the next phase. Those are your output variables. You'll use those in some of the YAML files that we'll use here in a sec. So the next phase is to spin up your Google GKE cluster. Here's a gcloud command for that. The important part is that you're landing in the same network. And your pod CIDR range, in this case, I use 10.200.0.0/14. I'm going to have to use that for communication to and from the F5 device for BIG-IP communication. So that's important to use. And remember, if you have a conflict of that address space, you can use a different one. Here it is in the output. Just make sure you record that and follow the remaining steps with your specific range. In this case, we'll use the 10.200. I'm going to modify my Google firewall rules to allow that pod network space. This is going to allow the pods to communicate to BIG-IP and the BIG-IP to communicate to the pods. Currently, it's just the internal subnet range. So go ahead and add the 10.200 space, hit save, and you're set. Now on the flip side for the BIG-IP, it needs to know how to route. So now that we are allowing traffic to and from the BIG-IP, you got to go into the BIG-IP and add TMM routes. So this route specifically is to the pod CIDR range. You'll notice in the routes that there's a default route and it's going out the external interface. We can't have that. We got to have the pod network space, at least in this demo, go through the internal interface. So I'm setting up the range and then a next hop of my internal network.1 address, which is my Azure internal gateway. To allow BIG-IP CIS Controller to manage objects on the F5, you got to have a partition. So in this case, we're going to create a quick partition, K8S in this case. Whatever you name it, just note it down. You're going to have to use that in the YAML files to deploy in this next phase. So at this point, we're going to get the credentials to connect and do kubectl commands to the cluster that we created earlier in Google. At this case, I have my credentials, and then I can do a quick get nodes. You can validate some other commands if you want. Now we can do some actual application and deployment and services. So in this case, there's a Juice Shop app, and it's a container already living on the public internet that I'm using for a demo. Just make sure your deployment and your service labels and names match. And in the service file, some of the AS3 tenant and the pool names, all those have to match within your config map as well. And that's what makes the magic work within the AS3 declaration that we'll see in a second. So in this case, we deploy a pod, and then we're deploying the service. That's going to spin up the workloads and then give it a service entry endpoint that we can utilize in our AS3 config map. The next phase here is we're getting ready for the CIS BIG-IP Controller install. So to do that, we need some secrets. We need a service account, and then we need a cluster role and binding. So that's what you see here. Go ahead and enter the BIG-IP admin password and username, and then enter those items in there. When you're done, you can take some of those service account names and modify your YAML file for the CIS controller. So we'll grab some of the values from the GUI here that we need. In this case, we're trying to connect to the BIG-IP internal interface. You'll see the self IP coming up 10.1.20.2. This may be different in your case depending on what kind of network you have. So the URL, I'm going to paste the IP. The partition is important. That's the one we created earlier, KAS in this point. I'm going to use a cluster instead of NodePort. And then some other things you can notice on there, like the AS3 for the agent, the secret key reference, and then also the image container version in case you want to roll back or stick with some type of static version. So in this case, I just deployed it. I'm going to get the pods, and we'll see that there's the BIG-IP controller sitting in the kube system namespace. If you copy that, you can do a kube CTL logs, and you can do an output of the pod and make sure that it's running. So in this case, we got a 200 code. So we were able to connect to the BIG-IP, and then it was able to sync the objects. At this point, we don't have a config map, so there's no BIG-IP objects, but that's what this part is here. So we're going to grab the public IP that the Terraform thing spit out for us before, and we'll use that for the VIP IP. That's going to go inside the virtual address. Some other key things to note in this YAML file is that it contains the AS3 declaration. These things like the tenant 1, the application name, the pool name, those have to match what you had in your service YAML file from before. Once you deploy that, you'll see that the config map is deployed. And now you can go over to the BIG-IP and do a refresh, and you'll see some objects created. In this case, tenant 1 is the partition name, and then you got your application name as well. The pool shows up automatically via the AS3 declaration in the config map, and number 5 is from the actual deployment YAML. If you go back and look at that, we set the instance count to 5 for the pods. In this case, we're going to do a quick scale up, scale down. We'll do a 15 count, and you'll see that you can go back to the BIG-IP and just refresh, and these pool members populate from the different service events that the CIS BIG-IP controller is listening to within the GKE cluster, listening for events, finding those new pods, matching the service labels, pulling them in. We did a 15 scale up, and then we did a scale down to 3. I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks a lot. Bye.